Did either of you see that coming?
No.
No.
I was more familiar with John Locke, and I say familiar like I knew his name.
Very interesting, the different ending that was written, and I think it was way better than the Huck Finn ending.
I brushed up on Huckleberry Finn. I didn't read the book, but I brushed up on what happens. And
is that just code for you Spark noted it?
Yes.
I brushed up.
Hey, nothing like a little gaslighting.
Quite the teaser there.
Let's go beyond the first page. Let's go beyond the first page.
Welcome back, second pagers, to Beyond the First Page podcast with siblings Phoebe, Phil, and Isaac. I'm Phoebe.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Isaac.
This is Club Meeting 28, James by Percival Everett, and it is the first club meeting of 2025, so Happy New Year, all. I know it's a couple weeks since the new year, but this is the first time that we'll be talking on a regular podcast since then, and so want to say Happy New Year to everybody. I hope that we can be a part of your 2025 reading goals and introduce you to some really great books this year. I want to just mention that this is a book club style podcast, and because of that, we will be talking about spoilers and major plot points from throughout James. And so even though it is a adaptation of Huckleberry Finn, if you don't want to get this book ruined for you, really recommend that you read this book. It's a pretty quick read, and then come on and listen to the podcast and listen to the discussion. Also, if you like this podcast, please follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, and if you enjoy the episode, please give us a 5-star rating. We would really appreciate it. And to start us off, as always, we are going to do an icebreaker. And because this is an adaptation of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, we wanted to talk about adaptations. And one of the bigger topics we really wanted to talk about today was that there's a lot of remakes going on right now. It seems like more than ever, but maybe that's just because we're, close to our 30s. And so like every 30 years, things start to be remade. But we wanted to talk about best adaptations, like remakes or adaptations of previous books, movies, what have you, that you have read or seen. And we could open up to movies because it's like a pretty niche topic. But I will say, and this is actually going to be my recommendation for James, is Demon Copperhead versus David Copperfield. So I've talked about this many times on the podcast, but David Copperfield is written by Charles Dickens. Demon Copperhead is written by Barbara Kingsolver, and it's a modern day adaptation of that Charles Dickens book. It's absolutely excellent. And so I think that's the best, besides James, which I really enjoyed, best adaptation of a book that I've read. Isaac, what about you?
So I was kind of going a different route. I had a book to a movie. I feel like a lot of times
that's good too.
Difficult to, to be fair, this was kind of sprung out on us the last minute. Struggling to think of a book adaptation, but I think a very cool one, and one that I haven't seen in a long time that I always remember really liking, and I think is really cool, is "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" as a adaptation of the Odyssey. I also really like the Odyssey as just a story in general. Have read some pretty good adaptations of that, actually, now that I say that. So there's a lot out there, but that's a pretty cool one.
That's perfect. Yeah. I was thinking movie originally when I thought of this as a topic. So that's great. Phil, what about you?
Yeah, I think mine is gonna be a little undercover, and I think we've talked about it, but Shawshank probably is the best. It was like a short story by Stephen King. But okay. Yeah, that's probably mine.
Nice. Well, I wanted to share more fun facts on the podcast too, but I think really our first topic that we wanted to talk about will also get us there. So it's kind of a second step of this initial icebreaker, and that's to talk a little bit about the hallucinations that James has. But before we get into that, let's just get James in 60 seconds, and then we'll go on to that topic.
Quite the teaser there. All right, yes. So this is James by Percival Everett in 60 seconds. James, known by almost everyone as Jim, is a slave that has run away from Miss Watson when he hears that he is going to be sold. He is hiding out on an island in the Mississippi when he comes across Huck Finn, the ward of Miss Watson, who has faked his own death to escape his abusive father. James plans on finding a way to free his wife and daughter, and Huck wants to come along. The two travel along the river, facing many challenges in what Huck would call adventure. The reader learns how intellectual James is and how Huck is grappling with his role as a white boy who is traveling and friends with James. The two become associated with two fraudsters who claim to be a king and duke. Huck and James get separated when the king and duke give James to a man in retribution for beating his slave. James is subsequently bought by the head of a minstrel group after hearing him sing. James is forced to disguise himself as a white man dressed up as a black man, but realizes that he will quickly be recognized doing that and escapes at the first opportunity. A black man who passed as a white man, Norman, escapes with him. They devise a plan for Norman to sell James, and he will repeatedly escape to earn money and buy back their respective families. The first attempt at this does not go well, and the two barely escape with their lives, ending up on a steamboat that blows up. In the water, James sees Huck, who happened to be on the boat as well, drowning, and his friend Norman drowning. James chooses to save Huck, and it is revealed he does so because Huck is James's son. The two go back to where the journey began. James resolved to free his family and get Huck back to safety. When they get back to Hannibal, Missouri, James finds out that his wife and daughter have been sold to a slave owner that breeds slaves. He kills the overseer after witnessing him rape a slave, then kidnaps Judge Thatcher to direct him to where his family is. The book ends as James and his family, along with a few other escaped slaves, run north after killing the breeding slave owner, burning it down, his farm, and allowing all the slaves on it to escape.
Okay, yeah, great summary, Isaac. Really gives us I like that summary because for me that really highlighted the deviation from Huck Finn, the original story, and James. But also just wanted to get your guys' initial reactions because I really enjoyed this book. It won the National Book Award in 2024. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed it. What did you guys think?
Yeah, I really liked it. And I actually came in a little separate than Isaac and Phoebe. I've never read Huck Finn and don't really know the Huck Finn story that well. And I still loved it. Thought it was really good.
What did you think, Isaac?
I'm very excited for this year, season 2 of the podcast. But we are starting out very strong, so we have to really keep our book choices up because this one was really awesome. Like, coming into the podcast 3 episodes in last year, it took a while. It took till November for me to feel this way about a book that we read.
Yeah.
So I think that bodes well for us. So everyone keep looking out. But yeah, it was great.
Yeah. I think something that, funny you mentioned that, Isaac, I think something that we're trying to do this year and last year for our book list, we did get a couple of comments like, why did you pick these books? I think we didn't do as much research as we probably should have, and we wanted to have a super diverse book list, which I think we definitely accomplished. But I think having a diverse book list, but also still making sure that we are picking books that either we ourselves know have been good based on recommendations or have won awards or seem very relevant to the topics that we really want to talk about. So as you said, Isaac, hopefully 2025 just gets better and
still
better.
Diverse, but hopefully not diverse in the spectrum of merit. That all the books are good.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah. And so as Isaac said, the ultimate teaser, we'll get back to the topic that I want to talk about. And I this is something that I did really want to talk about, especially because I wanted to hear Isaac and Phil's perspective on this. And I'll read the segment that really got me thinking about it because I think it will help our listeners and you and Isaac and Phil really, think about what I'm talking about. So this is a premonition or a hallucination that Jim is having, I believe, after he gets bit by the rattlesnake. So he says, if it isn't John Locke, I said, James, I knew I was dead, asleep, and dreaming, but I didn't know whether John Locke knew that. I've been thinking about you, I said. I've been pondering hypocrisy. Don't start up with that now, he said. It was a job. After I wrote the Constitution for Barbados, the Carolinians asked me to write them one too, and I wrote it. What you're saying is that if someone pays you enough, it's okay to abandon what you have claimed to understand as moral and right. When you put it that way, he said, when I put it that way, what? They wanted a constitution that would justify their behavior. If I hadn't written it for them, someone else would have. What in the world would have been different if that had happened? I looked at him. You tell me, I said. Some might say that my views on slavery are complex and multifaceted, convoluted and multifarious, well reasoned and complicated, entangled and problematic, sophisticated and intricate, labyrinthian and Dedalian. Oh, well played, my dark friend. Jim, Jim, Huck's voice split the air. Locke disappeared back into the water. And I liked the exchange. So if you couldn't tell, it's a little hard because I was listening to this when I read it too. So they're like Jim is saying your views on this are complicated and convoluted, and Locke is saying like, oh no, I had good views. So their exchange, that was them going back and forth. And so I wanted to talk about it because at the time of reading this, I have obviously forgot about John Locke and what his beliefs were in the world. And actually, funnily enough, we had just recently visited South Carolina. And so, Phil, you had said you went to a museum and read something about him writing the Carolina's Constitution. And so basically the whole thing is the hypocrisy. Like John Locke was saying he didn't believe in slavery, but then also he wrote this thing where basically they were saying that the Constitution for the Carolinas where the white man had ultimate control over Black people. And I wanted to hear your guys' reaction to that particular passage and if that stuck out to you at all.
Yeah, I think it was really good. I think after researching, I took away the points that it was meant to be, where sort of these guys are all writing about abolitionism and freedoms and like obviously just ignoring slavery. And I think that Voltaire was like, it's basically like treating it like a thought experiment. I read somewhere, and that's what he just hated.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is not a thought experiment. This is happening.
This is my life.
And he's just basically saying that this is all like egregiously bad. And I think everyone sort of recognizes that. But what people don't recognize, and what James gets a little bit more in depth, is that Thomas Jefferson basically plagiarized the entire Declaration of Independence, not only from John Locke, but also from George Mason, who wrote the Constitution of Virginia. It's just like which parts. And I think like people are like, oh, you plagiarized it. And that definitely has a negative connotation. But it was a lot of people just building upon these thoughts of the past. And that's sort of how it was less plagiarizing and more like, okay, John Locke is a respected thinker. Let's take this respected thinker. Here's what we're doing with this. And I think that that's like James is really diving into that. So that aside, and I think that that's super interesting, I got more that this is like, Jim has to hide this fact that he's James. Like Jim is actually James. And I think that's the whole point. Mm-hmm. He is an educated man. He fakes his own way of talking, way of being around white people. In the sense that I got that was actually really interesting is it was more of like a infantiling white people. Like they cannot handle the concept that this person is smarter than them, like is educated, like that will blow their mind. And James is like, I now can only have these conversations with myself because actually all the people around me are stupider than I am. And I have to hide that fact. That was really, really interesting and sort of like a more subtle way of conveying that fact. And I think the main point is obviously to engage in the political discourse that Percival Everett wants us to with the abolitionist belief. But I think more subtly, the fact that James is smarter than everyone around him, I think but can't show it is really interesting and really well done.
Yeah. So Phil, I was going to say, I got that as well. Like this was the author's chance to really, like, you had an idea as a reader. Okay, James is a pretty smart dude. Obviously, he's teaching this language to everybody. He has I think he can read and write at this point.
Yeah.
But then it's like, okay, this guy is actually very smart. He is like well informed with the past of the country that he's living in, and has arguments against the philosophers that, the founding fathers used as justification for many of the founding documents that we still use.
Yeah.
I thought your paragraphs were good, Phoebe. The other one, I think we had all had, or I was more familiar with John Locke, and I say familiar, like I knew his name, and we had just
Right.
gone to that museum and learned that he wrote the thing, so it was like kind of fresh. But he also did, or James also debated with Voltaire, who was a French philosopher, and I didn't know him at all, so I had to do some Wikipedia search on both these guys. But I won't read the whole passage. But in his conversation with Voltaire, he's pretty much saying, like, I think all men are created equal, but I'm against slavery. I'm an abolitionist. And James goes, "Thank you?" ? And and Voltaire's just, "You're welcome." And there's another at the end of one of his conversations with John Locke as well. It sort of ends where James says, "If I'm in a war, then I have the right to fight back." That follows, doesn't it? I have a right, perhaps a duty, to kill my enemy. And John Locke goes, "Well, now." And I think that just like both those little passages, it dive even more into the hypocrisy that can even be brought to a lot of situations today.
Yeah. I think also it was just for me, it was such a calling out the hypocrisy of all of it, as both of you have said. And it was didn't feel like vindicated, but I was like, this book delivered exactly what you wanted. It opens with, and I'll read this starting passage. And again, I had just read Huck Finn, so it was fresh in my mind. And he says, "Those little bastards were hiding out there in the tall grass." And then he goes on to say, "It always pays to give white folks what they want. So I stepped into the yard and called out into the night, 'Who dat there in the dark like that?' They wrestled clumsily about, giggled. Those boys couldn't sneak up on a blind and deaf man while a band was playing." And in the book, Huck Finn is saying, like, Jim would never see us. He would never be able to even believe that we would sneak out or anything like that. So from the start, it's delivering on all of the hypocrisy. And for me, the hallucinations were more of that. But Phil, you touched on something else of the speech, and you hear it just then when Jim is thinking to himself versus when he talks to Huck and Tom about the diction. And you said you thought it was this idea of how infantile white people were. And I wanted to push back on you a little, because it's not that they thought we couldn't. I guess I wanted to elaborate further. Like, I do think they thought that white people couldn't handle it, but because they were scared. Like, you would get beaten if you were, talking back or acting intelligent in front of a white person. Like, you weren't allowed to have a pencil. So I don't think, like you're saying, they were almost like feeling bad for white people because they thought they couldn't handle
it wasn't like a
people
feel bad. It was more of like that, like, yeah, and you're right to push back, and it more would be like that would rock the boat, which would then lead to violence against black people.
Yeah,
100%. But even with the kids, I think it was a little you're right. The second step in what they were surely preventing against this outward violence. So yeah, definitely right there, Phoebe.
Yeah.
This whole idea of the language and the diction, I thought, was pretty important. I know Phil had some more stuff on it, but something that I wanted to say about it is that along that same thing, like, yes, they were scared, but it was like you saw in the book the white characters scared and confused by it as well. Like when he slips up in the beginning and Huck is like, "Wait, why are you talking that way?" It was weird to them. So for Huck, it wasn't really a threat. And then he uses it Norman, his friend, uses the slave diction to prove to Huck, like, "Hey, I was actually a slave too. I'm just passing as a white man now." And that is like comforting to Jim. And then
that was a cue to him.
Yeah, and then he uses James speaks just normal diction to Judge Thatcher at the end, and he talks about how he had a gun pointed at this white judge, and the judge was like, "Why are you talking like that?" And that was the thing that was like the big holdup. So it was this huge like mental gap that, and he even says, James, like, the judge was not scared because I had a gun. The judge was scared because he realized that
I was equal to him.
Yeah, that we are equals.
Yeah. Very powerful.
Yeah, definitely very powerful.
No, I think that was a really good point about the judge. That scene really stuck out to me too. And then also the black man, Norman, who was passing. That was an indicator of the speech. That was an indicator to Jim that he was someone he could trust, basically. It kind of reminds me of The Vanishing Half, and that was the other book recommendation, so I've given mine too up front. But that is where there's twin women, and one, they look the same, but one was mistaken for white and now is passing as white, and her twin sister, who was identical to her, is, or I can't remember if they're identical, but they're twins, and she is black and has a very different life. And I know that's just the skin color. It's kind of getting away from the diction, but it's just very interesting. Like, once you are determined as black, then you are black. And then different things are happening to you because of that. Just like in this story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I thought the more like important than, I didn't really pick up on the diction as much. Like, obviously I did, but that wasn't something that really stuck with me. I just noticed the importance of the reading and the writing, which also goes into the same kind of conversation. Like, a man, young George, stole a pencil for James and ends up dying, getting lynched because he stole a pencil from his master. And it was just so precious to James to be able to read and write when he couldn't, because then, like you're saying, he would change this idea of black people in the white person's head. Like, he couldn't openly do that freely. And to me, there was a huge importance set on reading and writing in this book.
Yeah, Phoebe, there's an awesome quote that I pulled out from this, and it fits really well with that. This being a book club and whatnot, but the quote is when he is reading. This is when James is reading with Huck, and Huck is sleeping, and he's like nervous if he should like expose that he could read or not. Right. At that moment, the power of reading made itself clear and real to me. If I could see the words, then no one could control them or what I got from them. They couldn't even know if I was merely seeing them or reading them, sounding them out, or comprehending them. It was a completely private affair and completely free, and therefore completely subversive. Mm. But yeah, I think just as powerful of a message than the kind of diction of language, but the power of reading and writing, which I guess could just be like knowledge or
like access to knowledge.
Yeah, which again I think could be very much still relevant today.
Yeah, and the written word as well, like being able to pass on a story, which we've talked about in previous podcasts, like black authors, white authors telling black stories, because up until, even in the 1960s, black people were not being taught how to read, or it wasn't a priority to get them into public education. And this definitely illuminates all of that and highlights all that. And then, since you mentioned Huck, Isaac, I think we should definitely talk about that, because that aspect of this story is very different than The Adventures of Huck Finn by Mark Twain, because, as you mentioned, it turns out that Huck is actually Jim's son. And that was definitely I did not see that coming. Did either of you see that coming?
No.
Yeah.
I feel like I've read, maybe when I read this in high school, we talked about when we read, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, there was like like some people assume from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn that Huck is black as well.
I have read that.
But I don't know like really where that is from. I don't remember enough about The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn to point to why people think that. But
nothing indicated it to me. Yeah, very surprising. No, nothing indicated that to me. I would say the only thing is he is the most sympathetic character. Huck is the most sympathetic character in the story, in the original Mark Twain story, to Jim. specifically. That would be the only indication to me that there could potentially be a relationship between them. But even then, my notes were, I think Huck Finn got off pretty easily in this book. And if I was Percival Everett, I would have maybe really railed into him, even though he was only like 14 in the story. It was kind of like what you were saying, Phil, with these philosophers, like they're talking about it was a thought experiment to them. And that's like what it was to Huck Finn too. Like it was a thought experiment to him of like, he really grappled with, should I turn him in? It's illegal that Jim is running away, or should I help him because Jim is my friend? But it was all just like fun and games to him. And this was Jim's life. And then I think to me, I would have liked to see Huck get a little bit more justice to be served against Huck maybe in this book.
But that was the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn portrayal of Huck. I don't necessarily know if I don't know. I never got, like, if you came into this cold, I guess it'd be interesting to know Phil's take on this, but I didn't get a sense from this telling in this portrayal of Huck that Huck that Huck was deserving of a reckoning, I guess.
Okay.
Whereas
that's a good point.
With my, I brushed up on Huckleberry Finn. I didn't read the book, but I brushed up on what happened. And
is that just code for you Spark noted it?
Yes.
I brushed up.
Because I had read it. And as I was reading, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this. But
right.
If Huck was portrayed the same way, yes, I think you'd have to do I guess maybe you wouldn't have to, but the reader would be seeking a retribution. I wasn't seeking a retribution from Huck.
No, I didn't. I was very surprised when Phoebe talked about how Tom and Huck had sort of locked Jim up and delayed his freedom in the real book. I did not. That was at odds with the Huck that I knew from just James.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's just curious to me then why Percival Everett decided to portray him.
I wish we could have him on and ask him.
I know.
I have a theory. I have a theory because this book is about James and not about white people. There it is. That's my theory. This book is about James and not about like white people getting their ilk. And I think that that's what you get. Ilk is not the right word. I don't know what
getting their due.
Yeah. I think that that's the difference between David Baldacci writing this book and Percival Everett writing this book is that one, he doesn't know the Black experience, but two, it always tends to come around to the white person learning about the Black person. And that is, I think, something really unique and why you need representation in authorship, why you need the diversity of authorship. Yeah.
That's a great point, Phil. And as always, we just mentioned like we are three white people talking about Black issues. So this is all just us speculating. Yeah. Not Black issues. Like this is everyone's issue. Slavery was everyone, but
Black people's experience.
Yeah, like we're totally talking about from our experience. And so that's very limited. Yeah. Great point though, Phil. I would have never thought of that.
I like that way better than my point. I was kind of struggling. I was going to say that like youth is innocent. I feel like Huck was portrayed like I didn't see him as a 14-year-old. I don't remember how old he's supposed to be. I saw him as more like 8 or 9 in this book. And I sort of just read it as this like innocence of youth. Like he kept asking questions of Jim and this like idea of like, yes, you're not going to understand everything in the world, but you can't be afraid of that. You have to be accepting and you have to ask questions to learn. But I like Phil's answer much better. And I hope that is really what it was.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I know. I just think, I think just having come off reading the Twain version where there's like, I mean, the N word is just freely used. Obviously, this was written in the 1860s or even earlier, maybe. And like Phil was saying, Tom and Huck at the end of the Huckleberry Finn version, literally like Tom knowingly is aware that Jim is a free man and keeps him enslaved in this house or keeps him locked up in this house for weeks on end with putting like rats and snakes inside this house with him, delaying releasing him, delaying like because he wanted to have a plot and make it be fun. And that wasn't Huck, but Huck was like going along with Tom. So he was like complacent in all of it, which is like kind of the whole point of that story. But yeah, very interesting the different ending that was written, and I think it was way better than the Huck Finn ending. So and that really, I think too, like talking about an original idea, we talked about adaptations. I just think today I'm feeling very like, and I feel like other people, like the young millennial ages, are feeling this, just all these remakes, like enough with the remakes. Can anyone come up with the original idea? But I think the complete opposite is true for this, where this was a book that was, it was such a awesome concept. I felt like it was the perfect reply to this old book that has been considered an American classic. And I think for that reason, that different ending, and also for me, it was all of these, it was the ability for Percival Everett through James as a character to really highlight the hypocrisy of so many white constructs and ideas. And so that's what I really took away from the book. That was the biggest theme for me. And I think you guys probably had different themes. So I wanted to hear what you took away and what you thought. And was it a good, I'll say this, was it a good original idea, or did you think like overdone?
I don't think that this was overdone. I think it approached all of the tangential issues, if not the same issues, that the Huck Finn is just said to have, again, I sort of jumped in this one in cold water, but is said to have dealt with. And it does it in a just very new way where I cannot imagine Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn read like this. And I think that it was very well done. So taking sort of the opposite, because I can't really answer the question, is this remake great, Phoebe? From an original work, this was fantastic. From just like a completely standalone,
On its own.
very
Yeah.
good. And I think that there's something to be said of that, because I do think that, especially with, I wouldn't call this book a philosophical book, but it has a lot of philosophy in it, and a lot of that stuff you have to read everything that came before to get what people are talking about. And I don't think that I felt the need to do that. Even not knowing Voltaire and
Great
Locke,
point.
like we got stuff out of that without knowing this background. And I think there's something to be said of that, especially in a book that's 200 pages long, to be this dense and entertaining as well as like philosophical. Really just, it makes you think. Just really well done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also agree. I think it's even like tough to call this a retelling. I think it is more of an original work in and of itself. I would say it is inspired by the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn or something, maybe, like, because it does go off. And I remember reading Huckleberry and all those like old writings, they have like weird words, and yeah, they say the N-word a lot too, which is really bad. It just like does not flow like this book flowed.
Sure.
I don't know if I've ever had so much fun reading a book that has made me think so much. We read Beloved last year, and I know I personally struggled with it a lot because it, Toni Morrison won a Nobel Prize, and Beloved is like supposed to be one of
classic.
the best books ever.
Mhm.
And I really struggled with it. Whereas this book, I think, maybe didn't hit the same messages or had the same themes, but around a similar genre, and was so digestible. I personally think that's a reason it won so many awards. And I wanted it, like, I don't know if this is true, but I was reading it and there were moments where I'm like, this was written for a 30-year-old white man to think about what is going on with these issues of race, past, present, and future. I was reading it, and I guess I was listening, and I'm walking through my neighborhood, just trying to get a good chunk of an hour of reading done. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, I am really enjoying this story. And
Right.
then I immediately was like, that is maybe bad. Am I supposed to be enjoying this? Like, this is about a man running for his life because of ancestors of my Caucasian race. And then I am like, wow, I actually feel really guilty for enjoying reading this. And in that exact moment, this is the scene where they fall into the river. Huck and Jim fall into the river, and then I think they get back on the raft, and he sees like another boat go by, and Jim is like, "Did you see that?" Or James is like, "Did you see that boat and those people?" And Huck is like, "No, what are you talking about?" And he tricks him into thinking it was like that he was like imagining it. And then Huck is like, "Oh, I'm sorry," and he gets like the puppy eyes. And James goes, "White people love feeling guilty."
Yeah.
And that happens as I am like experiencing all that, and of course, it happens a lot quicker. That I'm feeling guilty for enjoying this book. And I don't really know what that means. This would be a good maybe thing to talk to a therapist about or something, but like like it was like the guilt of, white people's past to then like guilt for enjoying reading about this like horrible thing that this black man is having to go through. And then the black man goes, white people love feeling guilty. And
like
I'm just
the guilt of feeling guilty.
Yeah. I'm like, what the hell? Like, that is wild that just happened to me. So
is Percival Everett in my head.
Yeah. So I just think that like that I don't know if that's ever happened to me while reading a book or watching a movie or consuming any kind of literature, media, or anything. And I don't even know what that means. I don't know what theme that is, but the theme of, I guess I do know what theme it is. The theme of identity was the biggest one for me. There's that very powerful ending where he's referred to Jim most of the book. And then he starts calling himself James when he has really just been like, I'm becoming free. I'm going to free my family and I'm getting the hell out of here. And he starts, he kills the overseer that he witnessed rape that woman, which was horrible.
Right.
Then he takes the judge, ties him up, uses him to escape. And he keeps calling himself James to other people. So really powerful stuff. And I had to look at my identity. Like I'm a white guy thinking about my identity from this book.
Right.
So I think that the theme of identity was the main thing I got out of it. The power of a name, power of identity. It just like, it blew me away. Actually, as I'm talking, like remembering how great it was. So.
Good it was. Yeah. You're really hyping me up too. I'm like, dang, this is really good. And I think the other thing is like, it's just a really good book. It speaks to a huge audience. And that is why it won so many awards and why basically if no one has told you to read this, like you should read it. And that's why you're seeing all this buzz about it. It's because it's really worth the hype and it's just so well done. So yeah, well said, Isaac. Did you guys have any other quotes? I think I had one more that I wanted to just talk about, kind of going away from the topic we're currently talking about, but it ties in, I think, an earlier quote that you read, Isaac. It says, I had already come to understand the tidiness of lies, the lessons learned from stories told by white people seeking to justify my circumstance. I appreciated Voltaire's notion of tolerance regarding religious difference, and I understood, as absorbed as I was, that I was not interested in the content of the work, but its structure, the movement of it, the calling out of logical fallacies. And so, after these books, the Bible itself was the least interesting of all. I could not enter it, did not want to enter it, and then understood that I recognized it as a tool of my enemy. I choose the word enemy and still do, as oppressor necessarily supposes a victim. And if that covers like a lot of different things in one, but to me it was more about the power of being able to read, but then also highlighting like this is that white people were the enemy because like Black people didn't want to be called the victim. And I thought that was like an interesting quote and it really stuck out to me. So I wanted to share it with our listeners.
Yeah. We could probably do like a whole, quotes. Yeah, or I was gonna say like a mini series on just the interactions with his hallucinations, like especially if we could get some guests who really knew what they were talking about, but in another world perhaps. But definitely worth, I think, probably readers looking into that, like reading up on John Locke and Voltaire and kind of dissecting it for your own, because worthwhile thought processes to do.
Yeah. Well, then I think we should introduce our new rating scale. So we're going to go to a 5-star scale. And actually, I will ask that if any listener feels strongly about our 3-point scale, comment, let us know. I know some people have shared they like the 3-point. I think we're a little disinterested in trying to make that work. It just makes sense to go to a 5-star, kind of like the Goodread typical like Amazon book. Everything's 5-star. So this one will be easy because I think it's probably 5s across the board. It was a 5 for me.
It was a 5 for me as well.
Yeah, 5.
And I think that just like goes without explanation. Like 5-point, really, we don't need to explain ourselves. Just great book all around. And on our old scale, I think we'd all say it was a 3. So we'll keep that in legacy for the first episode and then graduate out.
Ease the transition.
Ease the transition, exactly. If anyone feels some type of way about it. And I've already given my recommendations. It would either be to read the Charles Dickens versus the David Copperfield and Demon Copperhead combo, or read The Vanishing Half. And The Vanishing Half talked about passing. And so that was the first time I had been exposed to that. And so it was very interesting to read about that. And that was a topic that was touched on in James as well. Isaac, what about you?
So I'm giving a rec to and also plug our past episodes. It's The Heart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. We read it last year for the club. It also has a theme of it has a theme of identity in a very different way. The main character is working through his identity more so than being able to portray your actual identity in James, but still a theme of identity in this one, and it was one of our favorite books last year, I think, for all three of us. So worth the read if you haven't read that.
Yeah, for sure.
So I have 2 recs. Sorry, I know that this is something that Phoebe does that I often tease her about, but I'm gonna just jump into the hypocrisy. One is for people who have young kids. I think that reading them Candide by Voltaire would be great, because I think on the surface level, it's just a fun novel about a little boy who explores this sort of dreamland. It's very similar to Gulliver's Travels, but then underneath it is just this entire political discourse that's happening. So both your kid will get a ton out of it because it's super fun, and then you hopefully will appreciate sort of the underlying. And then I think the second one is a Short and Tragic Life of Robert Peace by Jeff Hobbs. It's a true story about a kid who grew up in Trenton or Newark, New Jersey, and then went to Princeton and just grew up sort of, and nobody at Princeton could understand this kid's background at all. And it was actually written by his white roommate after he died. Just a really good story about another person who's very intellectual, but has to sort of hide that fact from the people around him. But obviously it's unfortunately more modern day. Really, really good one.
I've never heard of that, Phil.
Yeah.
Good recommendation. Cool. Okay. And then before we go, as always, let's talk about what we're reading next week. Isaac, would you be able to share with us about Night Watch by Jane Ann Phillips? It won the Pulitzer Prize.
Yes. So in 1874, in the wake of the war, 12-year-old Connolly, the adult in her family for as long as she can remember, finds herself on a buckboard journey with her mother, Eliza, who hasn't spoken in more than a year. They arrive at the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, delivered to the hospital's entrance by a war veteran who has forced himself into their world. They are far from family, a beloved neighbor, and the mountain home they knew. They try to reclaim their lives.
Yeah, I'm excited to read this. I have actually read this book before. Like I said, it won the 2024 Pulitzer Prize. I will be very curious if Isaac and Phil will enjoy it. I'm a little suspect, but I'm sure it'll be great. And as always, this is our sign off. It's a bi-weekly reminder to call someone that you love. Tell them to read James by Percival Everett. Go to your local library or use your Libby app. And until we talk again, stay classy, second pagers. We'll see you later.
Bye, guys.
Let's
See you
go
guys.
beyond the first page.